Welcome back to part two of our post-classical Europe lecture. So in part two, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some isms. We're going to look at feudalism and manorialism and then the social structure of Europe during the post-classical period. So let's start with feudalism. Feudalism is the political structure of Europe at this time, and it is a way that Europe is divided without some big central empire. For the most part, Europe is going to be these small kingdoms that are constantly warring against each other. It's a permanent state of conflict, basically. And so let's start with feudalism in the ideal, how it's supposed to work, and then we're going to look at feudalism in the reality, how it actually did work. So let's start with the ideal, right? And so what we have is we have this small kingdom, and in this kingdom we have a king, obviously. And the king, in theory, owns all the land, every square inch of it in his kingdom. Right? Now, this is too big of an area for one king to control by himself. And so what he does, he divides his land up into sections, and these sections are called fiefs. A fief is a piece of land that is a part of the kingdom. So I'm just doing a simplistic version here, but let's say the king has divides his land into 10 fiefs. And so he's going to have 10 pieces of land that he has divided up into, and he gives this fief or this piece of land to a friend of his, a relative, a supporter, somebody that promises to be obedient to the king. And this person is called the king's vassal. So the king gives a piece of land to this vassal, and the vassal promises that he's going to be obedient and support the king, and rule this piece of land, this fief, in the king's name. Now, of course, that fief may be too big even for this one vassal to control, and so he further subdivides the land into smaller fiefs, and these may be controlled by local knights. And it just may keep going down and down and down until the land gets small enough, until we have, an area that might be, I don't know, it might be like 10 acres, might be as big as 100 acres, something that's a fairly small piece of land, a fairly small fief. And so this in feudalism, so it has this land being further and further and further and further divided. And as we go down the feudal pyramid, we see that the people on the bottom are supposed to support the people above them in conflict and in war and those kinds of things. Now, eventually, when we get to the smallest fief, that it can't be further divided anymore, this warrior or knight will then have people working that land for him, actually doing the farming work, sowing and reaping and harvesting. And these people are typically called serfs. They are these semi-slaves in feudal society. They cannot leave the fief, they cannot leave the land, so that makes them slave-like. However, they cannot be personally bought or sold. They can't be separated from the land. So if you want to think of this labor system, it's semi-slavery because the workers are tied to the land. Whoever owns the land controls the serfs, controls these workers. And they come part and parcel with it. It's buy one, get one, right? And so there you go. And on a daily basis, they are not really supervised on a daily basis because the knight is too busy fighting in conflicts for himself or for the people above him. And so these serfs are kind of left to their own devices as long as they bring in some of the harvest and they give it to the knight above him. Right? And so this is how it all divides up. Now, so this is how power is divided and land is divided as we go down the pyramid and it gets smaller and smaller. Power gets smaller, land gets smaller. The more land you have, the more powerful person you are. All right. So what goes up the pyramid? Well, if I'm one of the top vassals, I might have the title like Duke or Baron. I make sure that since the king gave me land, in return, I have a reciprocal agreement. I give him taxes and troops in times of war, and I give him what's known as fealty, which means my support. I bow to him. I recognize that he is above me. And of course, then, the vassals that this duke or baron has, they may be knights. So he divides his land, his fiefs into them, and then, of course, they have to, in return, give him taxes and troops and fealty too. So it's this idea of land gets divided down, right? Fealty, respect, taxes go up. That's the kind of thing we have going on here, right? And at the very lowest level, of course, we have our serfs who provide labor. Their labor is in the form of a labor tax, right? They have to give their work and some of their surplus goods to the person above them. More about this on the next slide, on the next part of this lecture where we talk about manorialism. right? And so, so we have this pyramid. I only did one half of it, but you get the idea. Now, if you notice on the other side of this pyramid, we have something that's a little bit different. We have this figure here, and he's a church official. And so sometimes, instead of having a warrior, a baron, a knight on this side, we might have a church official. The reason being is in medieval Europe, we've already talked about how the Catholic Church is really powerful. And people in the medieval period believed that when you died, there were like three places, more or less, that you could go. You could go straight to hell if you were a horrible person and didn't believe in Christianity and didn't follow the Catholic Church. Or you could go to Purgatory. And Purgatory is where most people go that are Christians, according to the Catholic beliefs at this time. It's where you go to, over 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, where you have to be punished and suffer for your sins and kind of be purged and burned away until your soul is pure enough to go into heaven. And so when you die, you can go to hell, you can go to Purgatory. Purgatory is like the waiting room to heaven. You have to earn it to get to heaven, and then you go straight to heaven. And the only people that really go straight to heaven might be saints, people that are really super holy. All right, now, of course, if you're a Christian, you want to go straight to heaven, but most of us can't because we have some sins. We're not perfect people. And so you're going to go to Purgatory. But you can work your way out of Purgatory by giving the church money or land. And if you do that, then the church will say, okay, we're going to reduce your time in Purgatory 10,000 years or 500 years, which is a good thing if you're about to die. And so the church becomes a huge owner of land in the medieval period. In fact, the biggest owner of land in all of Europe, the Catholic Church, because all of these people are doing this. Now, this practice of the church giving people time out of Purgatory in return for money or land is known as an indulgence. And so the Catholic Church would sell these indulgences, which means kind of reduce your time in Purgatory. It was a big moneymaker for the church. It also gave the church a lot of political and actual economic power. Right, and so we do see this. And so now, if you're like a bishop, right, you have a whole bunch of land that has been donated to the church. That bishop, even though he's a religious figure, he still may divide that land up into fiefs and have warriors underneath him, right? And so, if the king goes to war, he says to the bishop, "Look, you have a lot of land in my kingdom, and so that must mean you owe me taxes and troops." And so, okay, so the bishop will send the king taxes and troops as long as the church says it's okay, but he doesn't owe him fealty, right? The only fealty or respect or bowing that he does, the bishop, is to the cardinal above him or the archbishop or the pope. And so we see, in theory, the feudal pyramid should be pretty simple. Power goes from the top down, and wealth goes from the bottom up, and as well as respect. But there are some wrinkles here. There is something that makes it a little bit challenging, is the church having some land as well. And so that's how it's supposed to work in the ideal. And so let's compare this to another place. How is this similar or different than Confucianism? Well, in Confucianism, we've talked about this, and we talked about the Catholic Church as well. In Confucianism, they certainly have the idea of respect. And so this is a little Confucian, if you want to think of it this way. All the people on the bottom or near the bottom have to respect and honor and do what they're told of the person above. So in that sense, it is somewhat like Confucianism. However, it's different than Confucianism because in Confucianism, the leader has to respect their followers by do what's right for the group as a whole. Now, in theory, the king and the duke and the knight are supposed to do that, but in reality, they don't do that at all, right? They're in it for themselves. They're in it for what they think is going to make them more powerful, richer. And so we really don't see respect going from the top down here. So it's somewhat similar to Confucianism, or it's a little bit different than Confucianism, but it's an interesting comparison. So, okay, so now I have told you, for the most part, how feudalism is supposed to work in the ideal, and in the ideal it looks very centralized, right? One person has all the power comes from him, and so you think, well, in the past you said that Europe is very decentralized, which we did in part one. Well, because Europe never actually works the way it's supposed to as far as feudalism goes. It's supposed to be this nice, even, understandable pyramid where power goes from the top down, respect goes from the bottom up. It's all centralized in one person. But as we've seen from the church example here, that's not always the case. Sometimes there's wrinkles in who owes fealty to whom. So in reality, feudalism does not work like a pyramid. It works more like a confused web. And I don't expect you to understand this whole confusing picture, but that's just the point, right? We see that feudalism is this confusing web of shifting alliances and power and land. I'll give you some examples. I've already talked about how the king is supposed to have all the power, right? Here's the king, he's supposed to have all the power. But we have said that sometimes bishops, even though they're supposed to give the king above them whose land they own in the kingdom troops and taxes, sometimes they don't give him fealty. They don't do what the king says because the Catholic Church says, no, respect me. The Pope says, respect me, not the king. Maybe the king and the Pope are having a disagreement. And so this bishop who has a lot of land in this king's kingdom may say, I'm not giving you troops. I'm not giving you respect, and I'm not giving you taxes because the Pope says no. And so it's not this nice, neat, tidy pyramid. In addition to that, we might have a noble, maybe a baron or a duke, some high-placed vassal. He may have land fiefs from two different kings, right? And so he may own land that's been given to him from this kingdom's kingdom, and over here he may also have some land or a fief from this king. And so he has kind of split allegiance. And if these two kings go to power, then it becomes really tricky. Which king does he support? And so there's lots of intrigue going along in the Middle Ages, right? And so we see sometimes nobles have to choose. And if they choose wisely, and they choose the side that wins, this vassal gets rewarded with even more land, more fiefs, more power. And if he chooses unwisely, and he chooses the wrong king in this war, he may lose everything. He may lose all his land, his titles, and just completely drop out of the nobility. And so we see that it's very different. Also, a local knight may own fiefs from two different nobles. And we can see again that this is very confusing. It's not an easy power pyramid. It can be confusing based on if the church is involved and if a knight or a noble owes land to other different people. And so this is kind of the confused web and shifting alliances that make the medieval period very chaotic and very violent. And so that's it for feudalism. Let's now go to manorialism. So a manor is what manorialism is named after. A manor was the smallest way we could divide up the land, right? And so we keep dividing land into smaller and smaller fiefs until we get to the smallest piece of land that can't be divided anymore, and that is this knight with his peasants, his serfs. And so we had said that it's a fairly small piece of land. And so here's the knight, right? He got this fief from the baron or the noble above him, and it's his to run as long as he gives taxes and troops and fealty or respect to the person above him who gave it to him. So on this manor, this is where the knight lives, and the nicest house is called the manor house, right? And then in theory, all of this land is owned or operated by him on loan from the noble, on loan from the king above him, if that makes sense, right? And so now, obviously, this guy is going to spend most of his time doing knight things, right? He's going to be practicing his swordsmanship, his horsemanship. He's going to be, going to tournaments. He's going to go honor the king. He's going to be away. And so he's not going to work the land with his own two hands. He has serfs for that, right? And so what he does is he says to the serfs, this is where the serfs live in this little village over here. These are their tiny little houses. And he says, you can live on my land, right? As long as you do work for me. And so we have a reciprocal agreement. The knight says, I will let you live on my land in turn for your labor. And so these lands are they're all owned by the noble, the knight. And so the peasants, 3 days a week, they work on the lord of the manors, the knight's fields. They plant, they harvest, they weed, they water, etc., right? And so all of that produce at the end of the season goes to the knight, the noble, the aristocrat in charge of the manor. Now the next 3 days of the week, these peasants can work maybe some of their own land that they have been put on loan to them. Maybe this is a piece of land for this guy, right? So it's smaller, but this is what he's supposed to feed himself from. And so the bigger piece of land, all of that produce goes to keep the noble happy and his table full. This little piece of land, right, this is what the peasant is loaned from the nobility, and he has to work it, and that's how he has to feed himself. And if it's not enough, too bad, maybe you starve, not the noble's problem. right? Next, this forest is owned by the noble, and so this is maybe where the deer are, all right, or foxes or rabbits, and so where the protein is, and so this is off limits for the serfs. They cannot go there, and so the serfs have very difficult lives. They work 50% of the time for the nobility, and then that means 50% of the crops go to him. And then also sometimes in tough times, or if the noble wants it, he can even take a portion of this peasants, this serf's crops, even from his own land. And so we can see that the peasants, the serfs, I should say, really have almost nothing left. Now, so if you've noticed, I've done 3 days working in the Lord of the Manor's lands, and then 3 days working for themselves. So that leaves 1 day a week, and that day of the week is Sunday. And on that day of the week, the peasants are supposed to go to the village parish. So we can see how the church is in here, right? And so this is where the church is, where everybody has to go pray. This is where the local parish priest is, the lowest level priest. And so there you go. But the church also needs to, feed their priests. They also want money. And so 10% of what the peasant has or the serf has goes to the church as well. So if you can imagine, right, these serfs have very little left to eat themselves. They don't get any of the protein from the forest. They have to 3 days of the week work the Lord of the Manor's land. Then the other 3 days they can work their own land. But even then, a portion of that goes to the Lord of the Manor. And even then, 10% of that goes to the church. So the idea I'm trying to paint here is there's very little food left for the peasants. And if there's a bad harvest, if the winter was too long or the summer was too wet or too dry, well, the church and the nobility, they don't care. All right, they're just going to say, I don't care if there was a bad harvest, you still owe me the amount I want, which means that what's left over for the serf is even less. And so we see lots of periods of starvation for the poor people at this time as well, right? So here we see a definition, right? Serfs, most people are too poor to own their own land, so they have to work on the noble's land, right? So this is called, it's a French term, it means corvée labor. It means that you are kind of semi-slave, forced, coercive labor, where you're forced to do things you don't want to do, give crops to people you don't want to give it to, because they're more powerful than you. Now, in theory, the nobility, the knight, is supposed to protect the people on the manor. Sometimes he does. Certainly he doesn't want them all to die, because then he has nobody to work the land and give him his food. But sometimes he just terrorizes his own people. He overtaxes them. He may rape some of the women on the manor. There's really nothing he can't do because he has higher social status and he has a sword, and he's a trained warrior. And so things are pretty rough for the serfs, right? Now there are peasants in medieval Europe. These are people that are common people that have enough money to own their own land, but it's usually very small, and there's not as many of them in many areas of Europe as we see of these serfs. Some places there are more, some places there aren't, but the difference between serf and peasant is the serf owns none of their own land and the peasant owns some of their land. And so we see here we have 2 different labor systems: independent farmers known as peasants and serfs that are corvée or forced labor. All right, so here we have a list of all the things that the serf has to owe his owner, right? And so he owes the lord crops, which we've talked about, and he owes them 3 days of labor every week. Now, also, if he's grown some wheat on his own little plot of land and he wants to turn that wheat into flour, he's forbidden by law to grind that wheat into his own flour. He has to go use the Lord of the Manor's mill, and then of course he has to pay a tax also, so some of that flour goes to the Lord of the Manor, and so even less is take home for the serf, right? Next, he cannot use the Lord's forest. We talked about that, and we also said that he has to tithe or give 10% of his income to the Catholic Church, which means even less left for the serf. So pretty rough and tumble life for the serfs. All right. Now, let's talk about another topic that deals with manorialism, is that there's very little trade in the medieval period inside of Europe, right? What we see here is that since Europe is so decentralized, so chaotic, so many wars going on, that if I want to step off of this manor and trade with the people on the next manor, well, maybe the knight over there is like, what are you doing on my land? And he'll kill me. right? Or if I have this road here, maybe the local king keeps the roads open in his kingdom, maybe, and he keeps them protected. But what happens when the road goes to the next kingdom? Well, these two kingdoms are rivals, and so maybe they'll attack you. Or maybe if the noble is not doing his job, he's not protecting the peasants and the merchants. Maybe there are bandits that, like Robin Hood famously, right? Maybe they live in these forests and they will attack anybody that comes and tries to use these roads. And so it's a very lawless, chaotic, decentralized time, and so it just makes trade difficult. And so we see that the manor has to be kind of self-sufficient. Everything that these peasants need to live, for the most part, needs to be made on the manor. And so usually there's a blacksmith on these manors to do the farming tools and the horseshoes for the horses, maybe make some of the knight's equipment, but they have to be fairly self-sufficient just because of the lack of trade. All right, next let's go to social order. And so in Europe, we have what these things are called the three estates, which is French for means social classes, basically. And so let's talk about them. So the first estate are those who pray. And so this goes from the Pope all the way down to your local, not very powerful parish priest. Anybody who officially belongs to the church, they're in the first estate. Now I said as a group, the first estate has a lot of power because a lot of people have donated land to the church to try to get out of purgatory. So they have a lot of power, and so they're very high up in the social standing. And so these people are, the first estate are the church. Then second estate is the nobility. And the nobility can be all the way down from the lowly knight who owns a small manor to a baron, a lord, a duke, or at the very highest levels, a prince or a king. And so we have some variety in this group, but the thing that unites all of the second estate is they fight. That's their job. Their job is to fight, to remain ready, to support the person above them, whoever that may be, in a war, and to provide troops. And so this is the second estate, the nobility, right? You get into the nobility by birth. If your dad was a knight or a duke or a lord or a king, then you will stay in that estate. Now, the problem here is we have these laws called primogenitor. So if your dad is the king, then only his firstborn son will be the king, the new king. If your dad is a duke or a lord or whatever, then only his firstborn son will be. The second, third, and fourthborn sons, so sorry, you're just there as an heir. If the firstborn son dies, then okay, then you will be the spare to the heir, right? And so all these nobility, they want at least two sons, an heir and a spare. And so there we go, right? Now, what if you're a second or third born son and that means you're not going to inherit anything, and you're going to have to do all your life, you're going to have to do what your older brother says. And so maybe you might escape the second estate, and what you'll do is you'll just join the clergy. And that may mean that someday you can be a powerful person, because if your dad loves you and he cares about you, and you're a second or third born son, maybe what he'll do is he'll say to the church, look, make my son a bishop, make my son a pope, make my son an archbishop, and if you do, I will give you a lot of land and a lot of money. And so immediately your family benefits because you have somebody powerful in the church, and you benefit because you have high status. And so it is possible to go from one social class to another, right? Nobody's born into the first estate because they're supposed to be celibate. They're not supposed to have sex or get married. And so really, typically, the first estate, the higher levels are filled with second and third born sons of the second estate. All right, so what does the third estate do? And this is about 95% of the population. It's the most percent of the population. They work, right? And maybe they're a peasant and they own their own land, so they're a little bit more well off. Okay, great. Maybe they're a serf and they own no land, and so they're at the whim of the local nobility and the lord of the manor. They're very poor. They might be artisans. They might be blacksmiths or silversmiths or coppersmiths or wheelwrights, guys that make wagon wheels, or cobblers, guys that make shoes. Right? And so they have a little better life because they have a skill, which means that they're going to be paid a little bit more and respected a little bit more by the nobility. And so we see there's lots of variety in the third estate, but most of the third estate is going to be farmers, either peasants or serfs, who are very poor. And typically, if you were born into a third estate, you will probably stay in the third estate. It is possible to move up. It does happen on occasion where a peasant saves a noble's life, or he shows his loyalty or something like that. and they become a low-level person of the second estate, but that really doesn't happen very often. And so we see the class structure is pretty solid here. It's pretty stable. The only time we see a lot of movement between the two classes is second and third-born sons going from the second estate to become a church member in the first estate. All right, so it's hard to move up, right? Where are merchants in this? We've talked about artisans and serfs and farmers and knights and church members, but where are the people who make their living by trading from one place to another? Well, if you remember, we already addressed this. There's very little trade that goes on across Europe at this point in time in 1200, and so we just don't see a merchant class. Now, we will later in this lecture, but we don't see one yet. And so before 1200, and right around 1200, we're just going to see that Europe is very decentralized, chaotic, lots of conflict. We have these third estates, there's manorialism, and not a lot of trade. So now let's go to the learning objectives for part 2. Describe how feudalism was ideally structured and how it functioned in reality. And we said ideally it's supposed to be very centralized, with the king having all the land and power, and then it getting further and further divided and smaller as we go down. Power starts at the top and goes down. Land and taxes and work is at the bottom and goes up. But in reality, we said it really didn't work that way, that it's this more confused, decentralized web. Next, it says, analyze the labor systems found on manors in the Middle Ages. And we had said for the most part it's peasants and serfs. So serfs were people that had no power at all, that had no land, and they're very poor. Most of what they made goes to either the church or the lord of the manor. Then we also said we have peasant labor. They are peasants that own their own land, that are a little bit well off, a little bit more well off than the serfs, but still they're farmers. 5. Explain how trade was limited. And we said that it was just a very chaotic time in the Middle Ages, that it was very decentralized and chaotic, and so not a lot of trade. Number 6, describe the social structure of the Middle Ages. We said that there is 3 social structures, the first, second, and third estate, those who pray, those who work, and those who fight, and there wasn't a lot of in-between movement between the two. And that's it for part 2.